As Final Fantasy XIII concludes, it wraps up the character arcs of each of its main characters. Snow and Lightning are reunited with Sarah. Dodge is freed from captivity and returned to Saz. Hope has come to terms with his place in the world, and Vanille and Fang have become a massive crystal tower that supports the world of mankind as we know it. It ends. But, much like Final Fantasy X before it, the massive success of Final Fantasy XIII from a sales perspective, as well as a development team and fan-driven interest perspective, meant that there must be more. And so, from the ashes of Final Fantasy XIII's rocky development, a follow-up would be born. And this time, it would be delivered on time, within budget, and without the blood of a half-dozen other anticipated titles on its hands. Buckle up and prepare to float through space and time with me, folks. It's time to dig into Final Fantasy XIII-2. The genesis for the idea to craft a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII came from 2 points. The development team felt that there was significant enough fan demand, and according to 13 director Motomo Toriyama, speaking at the 2011 Square-Enix First Production Department premiere event, the team also wanted to continue the story of Lightning. They felt that the original game ended with a lingering question as to whether Lightning was truly happy after the events of the game. They wanted to craft a story that would create a more clear conclusion to Lightning's journey. You're probably wondering, as I was, why they needed to do such a thing considering the clear conclusion of Lightning's story as 13 ends. An epilogue novel, Final Fantasy XIII Episode 1, was written and included as part of a bonus booklet included with the Ultimate Hits International version of Final Fantasy XIII for the Xbox 360 in Japan. This novel, only available to English readers via a fan translation that I will link in the description, lines a number of events up that lead directly into the events portrayed in 13-2. The major event that it details is one in which Lightning makes the decision to try and find a way to save Vanille and Fang from their fate as crystallized l'Cie. This leads her to an unexplored region of Grand Pulse for answers, and it is there that she supposedly disappears into an unknown realm of darkness. In this novel of sorts, Sarah and the others learn that Lightning has gone missing, but only Sarah believes that Lightning is still alive and out there.
Wait, you know Lightning?
Knowing this, director Toriyama's statements at that premiere event make a little bit more sense. Using that as a basis for the story of 13-2, the development team set out to make a more efficient game, hinting at the possibility of using leftover bits and pieces from the massive development of 13 to help subsidize some of the groundwork for the new sequel. They opted to use a Western-style development structure with frequent meetings and milestone objectives in place to meet for said meetings, modeled after the development habits of studios owned by Eidos, and planned to have playtesting as much as a year earlier in the development process than they did for the original 13. Final Fantasy XIII-2 was also the first title developed by Square-Enix to farm out development responsibilities to an outside team. In this case, Star Ocean and Valkyrie profile developer Tri-Ace was contracted to provide assistance with game design, art, and programming on the title to allow development resources within Square Enix to be more evenly divided amongst other titles they were working on. Extensive player feedback was gathered after the release of 13, and the team in turn designed XIII-2 to specifically address the problems they noted. There was a shift in focus from linear, story-driven gameplay to player-driven gameplay after many players felt they had a passive role in experiencing 13, and a heavy focus on crafting an open world full of events and things for players to do in order to promote player engagement with the game's world and its storytelling. The team felt they did all of the heavy lifting in terms of world building in the first game, so they felt more comfortable focusing on the gameplay with the follow-up. They also decided early on to give XIII-2 a darker, more serious tone to attempt to reflect the destruction rained down upon the world as 13 concluded, with the game's art director taking inspiration from the works of Salvador Dali and others in crafting some of the game's new environments. The story writers also settled on telling a story centered around a time paradox rather than the constructs that drove 13 forward, such as the fallacy and l'Cie, feeling that those concepts weren't terribly well explained and therefore were not worth focusing on again, choosing to write a story designed to be experienced more in small chunks than in broad strokes. They took inspiration from episodic TV drama writing in crafting the game's story pacing and overall structure, leaning on the concept of visiting the game's locales across different chunks of time to tell smaller, more isolated stories. Because of all the groundwork laid through 6 years of Final Fantasy XIII development, the contracting out of development duties to Tri-Ace, and the adoption of Western development strategies, Final Fantasy XIII-2 was released in Japan on December 15, 2011, just 2 years after the initial release of 13 in the region. Its release was accompanied by a novel titled Fragments Before, which serves as a prologue to the events of 13-2, and the promise of a follow-up novel, Fragments After. Both of these novels would not be translated for English markets until 2019. And yes, I have, and am currently reading both of them because I am sort of an idiot. It was also accompanied with a Japan-exclusive PS3 bundle and a postcard book that retailed for 1,260 yen. It also received a lavish collector's edition upon its release in the United States, and a plethora of downloadable content including outfits, weapons, accessories, scenarios, monsters, and even new minigames. There were even DLC tie-ins to Assassin's Creed and Mass Effect. With all this focused development, user feedback-driven design, and release hubbub, the game's gotta be good, right? Unlike with Final Fantasy XIII, I did not play 13-2 then and there. I do not have the same romanticized attachment that I do with its predecessor. This is not going to be an 80-minute video. Having now played it twice, once in 2019 after it was added to the Xbox One backwards compatibility program, and again over my 2021 December holiday break to prepare for writing this video, I do think that it is a pretty interesting game for a couple of really interesting reasons. Like with Final Fantasy XIII, I'm gonna chunk those reasons into distinct categories. Some of them are gonna be very familiar. We're gonna talk about the structure first, because I think it's a little bit more important than the story. Then we're gonna talk about the story, the gameplay, and then of course, the legacy of Final Fantasy XIII-2. Philosophically speaking, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is the product of a teacher passing back an essay that somebody clearly wrote the night before it was due, covered in red pen. In this case, that red pen is fan feedback and critical response to Final Fantasy XIII following its global release. Despite massive sales and a generally positive critical reception, there were quite a few people voicing their concerns loudly, and in spaces where Square-Enix could hear them. Essentially, what they said was that it was too linear and restrictive, the storytelling was too mysterious and confusing, there wasn't enough player autonomy in terms of gameplay and story participation, and there wasn't enough for players to do in the world they were inhabiting. In response, the development team attempted to deliver a game that was largely non-linear and filled with over a dozen areas that were explorable across multiple points in time, driven by a story that minimizes new concepts and instead focuses on a tangible goal with a distinct villain to work against from the outset of the game, featured complete player autonomy over movement and character progression, and was full of side quests, mini-games, optional dialogues, and even a casino area for players to take advantage of during their playthrough of the game. In playing through Final Fantasy XIII-2 back-to-back with Final Fantasy XIII, you get the sense that the design document for the follow-up was a list of targeted ways to simply satisfy the loudest criticisms, rather than lean into what made Final Fantasy XIII so interesting, while also addressing those critiques. At the core of everything happening during your playthrough of 13-2 is the structure known as the Historia Crux.
It's the Historia Crux, the crossroads of the time continuum.
The Historia Crux is essentially a fancy name for the game's world map. Every area you can visit is accessible from a set of interconnected paths laid out in the Historia Crux, which you can visit at any time, however many times you want. The freedom to simply pack up and leave from any location you're currently in to visit the world map and go somewhere else in space and time that's accessible to you without time-consuming traversal makes this perhaps the most accessibly non-linear Final Fantasy title ever made. Sure, there's only 14 places to go, and some of them may only be available to you in one timeline, but you can literally drop what you're doing and go somewhere else at any point in the game. It's quite literally the opposite of 13's structure. If you don't feel like progressing in the story quest, you can. Just hit the start button and warp out of whatever you're doing. Each of these 14 locations you can visit is chock full of activities, events, and hidden items that grant you experience and access to different areas in the Historia Crux. The downside to this is that each of these distinct areas, such as the Sunlith Waterscape or the Brescia Ruins, only has one map. And after you explore it in one timeline, it gets repeated and it starts to feel a little repetitive moving through each space over and over and over to complete every objective and find every item. The game tracks how many fragments you collect over the course of your playthrough out of a total of 160 fragments. For each fragment, there's at least one or more activities associated with it. That means that, unlike in Final Fantasy XIII, where there was really just combat and item searching for the majority of the game, 13-2 is crammed full of things to do. There are tons and tons of fetch quests, quiz games, a surprising amount of connect the dot, two kinds of puzzle mini-games, one in which you maneuver the hands of a clock to clear the board, and another where you have to map out a path through the board to collect some gems, and sometimes even a quest that takes you across the same location in multiple timelines. Ooh. Some of them, mostly story-related activities, lead to boss fights that put your combat abilities to the test. You can do most of these things in any order you'd like. The only real restriction is how far along you are in the main story quest. Progressing through that quest grants you basic access to at least one time period for each of the 14 areas. Unlocking the rest is strongly suggested, but ultimately ends up being optional. Each of these areas is also filled with a lot of people to talk to and people conversing as you move through these clearly lived-in spaces. And there's a general sense of life that large parts of 13 were missing. It doesn't really impact game structure, but it's very clear that they wanted us to know that they tried to make the game world feel alive, in contrast to the largely empty spaces of its predecessor. The way 13.2 is structured feels like they took all of the criticism directed towards 13 and sucked each point as dry as they could in designing its follow-up. Each bit of 13.2 that counters something that people didn't like about 13 is very prominently featured, sometimes to the point of cartoonishness. There are a lot of really uninspired fetch quests that often will send you from one side of a given map to the other. It's almost impressive how boldly bland they got with those. If Final Fantasy XIII was structurally the anti-Final Fantasy, 13.2 is very much the anti-Final Fantasy XIII. It's cold, it's calculated, it's almost unpleasant in how intensely it responds to that highlighted criticism of 13. It's like they took the third act of Chrono Trigger, where you're given free rein to explore the world and complete side quests, and made an entire game out of it. It's loose, but packed to the gills with stuff to do. It's remarkable how much easier it is to engage with as a result. In keeping with the general sense that Final Fantasy XIII-2 is the anti-Final Fantasy XIII, 13.2 tries its hardest to make you forget about everything that was central to the world building of its predecessor. It repeats some of the locales featured in 13, but it tries its best to distance itself from a world governed by Fal'Cies, L'Cies, and the Sanctum. You still need to know what the deal is with Cocoon, but only because the bad guy in this game wants to knock it down. 13.2 tells the story of the journey that Sarah Farron, Lightning's sister, whom we freed from a lifetime encased in crystal, takes following the events of Final Fantasy XIII. For some reason, Lightning is missing. Snow, her fiancé and former 13 protagonist, has run off to try and find her, and no one else seems to think Lightning is still alive.
Your sister's...
As it turns out, Lightning is in a futuristic hellscape called Valhalla, fighting against resident bad dude Caius Ballad, who's attempting to destroy Valhalla and Lightning with it. In the final moments of their vicious duel, which opens the game, Lightning happens upon a man named Noel Kreis. In an act of desperation, she sends him back through time and space to find Sarah, hoping that together they can change the events of the past that led to Caius getting all sorts of bothered, which somehow leads to them also needing to alter the events of the future. You heard that correctly. At the core of the game's plot is the idea that you can change the events of the past by going forward and altering the future. Pause now if you'd like to take the recommended milligrams of ibuprofen for children or adults before continuing. Over the course of the main story quest, Sarah and Noel use the aforementioned Historia Crux to travel from place to place, resolving different time paradoxes. They do this in order to figure out why Caius is so mad in the first place, and how they can stop him from destroying all of time. Very little is explained in a satisfying way, nor does anyone seem to care how many of this game's new constructs seem to work. It feels like Saturday morning cartoon levels of storytelling. There's very little depth or characterization woven into the game. Luckily, the main quest moves at such a pace, if you so choose, that you seldom have to think about it, but it is absolutely chock full of wild stuff. The main story quest is a series of episodic events in which Sarah and Noel travel to different places in different spots in time to solve a series of conundrums. Some of these events are pretty cool, like discovering a monster in one timeline that's working to knock Cocoon down, and then using the Historia Crux in order to travel backwards in time to weaken a younger version of that creature, allowing you to destroy it in the present where you found it. Some of these events involve you traveling to an area, learning you need a key that's been lost in another timeline, and then traveling to that particular timeline to retrieve it. I suppose, as Dr. Steve Brule once said, you can't have a jetpack and a cool uncle. In the process of completing most of these innocuous tasks, you'll run into Caius, who's always doing something to try and work against you. Each time you run into him, you learn a little bit more as to who he is and why he's doing what he's doing. Eventually, you even learn how he's tied to Noel himself. It's more gripping than 13 due to its pacing. 13-2's main quest shouldn't take you more than 25 hours to clear, even with most of the side content completed. With the ability to set your own pace and priorities, the game moves fast and delivers exposition fairly frequently. Gone are the lulls that slowed down its predecessor's pacing. Even when the story is at its least coherent, it doesn't stick on one plot point for very long. If this was all the game tried to do, it would probably be fine. It's a little too self-serious for its own good, but the worst thing is that everything surrounding the main quest is so absurd that it gives one whiplash just interacting with it.
Child of miracles, traveler of time, guided by Etro, listen to me.
Imagine going on a daring quest through space and time to save all of reality, only to be confronted with this every time you need an item.
Chocobocalinda! Welcome, get your traveling. The beauty's all mine, but the products can be yours, but only if you show me the money. This might be a once-in-a-lifetime choco-amazing opportunity, so don't miss out.
Hi there. I'm a little overwhelmed and slightly confused, to be honest.
I'm a little overwhelmed and slightly confused, to be honest.
Or you revisit a location only to be greeted with a side quest that looks like this.
Where do they get all that energy from?
This has gone too far. That's enough! I've about had it with your mischief. You should be ashamed of yourselves for behaving like this. You should know better. Well, what do you have to say for yourselves?
Or you get on a red chocobo and this starts blaring. Or you step into one of the game's many time paradoxes and are greeted with a puzzle that plays out like this. Seriously, in the process of trying to get all 160 fragments, you spend at least 2 hours of your time playing Connect the Dots. And they want me to take the stakes of this main quest seriously? It's like they tried their best to make the main quest as serious as a mid-2000s network TV program, but the rest of the game is just Adult Swim ad bumpers. I know that this kind of storytelling is all over JRPGs, but it feels particularly jarring when you have interviews in which the team spoke of trying to craft a darker, more serious game. It's a good thing the gameplay rocks. I mean, it completely owns. If it wasn't already clear, I have a huge fondness for the paradigm shift mechanic and stagger bar driven ATB combat of Final Fantasy XIII. The only thing that really ever held the excellence of combat back in that game was the rigid structure that piecemealed out progression and choice over the course of the game's 13 chapters. The good news with 13-2 is that it keeps everything that worked from 13, such as the distinct character classes that each one can switch to, and removes all of the barriers that made 13 such an inflexible beast to work with. Both Sarah and Noel start with a predefined main class, Ravager and Commando classes respectively, but you are given a handful of additional classes to develop right off the bat, and after minimal Crystarium point acquisition, can start unlocking additional classes without wasting too much time. You're not given everything right away, but within a few hours you can easily get a pair of lead characters that have access to every single class. From there, you can prioritize spending your CP as you like. Both of your leads have slightly different variations on the same classes in terms of available abilities. For instance, Sarah has more available abilities in the Saboteur and Ravager classes versus Noel, who has more available abilities in the Synergist and Commando classes. Neither of them get a complete loadout, which forces you to design paradigms around knowing the complementary strengths of each one. The new addition to 13-2 is the swappable third member of your party. Unlike in 13, where there's 6 members of the player party that you rotate in and out, your third member is drawn from a group of monsters that you collect and train using specific items found throughout the game world, earned from combat, and purchasable through the store. Each monster has a single class to build out in a manner much like the main characters, and they each hit experience-based checkpoints that allow you to boost ability scores and increase the number of actions they can take per turn. You're allocated 3 slots for monsters that you can bring into battle with you, which allows quite a bit of customization when it comes to designing paradigms to complement the strengths of your lead characters. The editing and revising of the battle system from 13 is 13-2's greatest strength. The improved progression and the addition of the monster collecting element unlocks the true potential of 13's combat. In the previous game, you were limited by the number of players in your party and hard limits tied into the game's story. In 13-2, you can basically do whatever you'd like, however you'd like, as long as you have the monsters, the CP, and the monster upgrading components to do it. It completely owns. Everything else in combat is fairly consistent with how 13 worked. Ravagers cast magic to increase the stagger bar, Commandos deal physical damage and maintain the stagger bar, and so on and such forth. Abilities have been slightly tweaked to improve pacing and the balance of combat, but the steps to success are largely the same as they were. Lean on the newly improved and mildly smarter auto battle and focus on switching paradigms to maximize damage, buffs and debuffs, and recovery. It's everything I could have ever wanted out of 13's ATB combat system. Beyond just combat, there's a surprising amount of aggressively gamified pieces added to 13-2. Concepts as simple as searching the map for items now have additional buttons tacked on to increase player interaction. You travel with a Moogle that can emanate a magic radius that unveils hidden items, and you can later launch your Moogle like a cannonball to acquire items hidden outside of the playable area. It's an interesting addition to world traversal that's a bit much on paper, but surprisingly ends up being fairly tasteful in execution. There's also that set of 3 mini-games that show up quite often as barriers to progression. One is that game of Connect the Dots that I mentioned. One is a minigame in which you move the hands of a clock to clear the board, which is a little tedious in execution, not because of its difficulty, but because of the frequency with which it shows up. And then there's a fairly straightforward minigame in which you have to move forward while collecting a series of gems without falling through the floor. These were added to address the criticism that 13 didn't have enough minigames to participate in. I guess now 13-2 does. And in order to get 100% fragment completion of the game, you have to participate in a lot of them.
I knew you could do it if you tried, Kubo.
Final Fantasy XIII-2 definitely feels more like a game in the sense that there is definitely more game to play. Without the pressure of having to build an entire world and a huge stack of feedback to act on, the teams at Square-Enix and Tri-Ace took the raw sheet metal that was Final Fantasy XIII and pounded it into something that feels a whole lot more like a video game, if you get what I mean. Its plot is loose and borderline nonsensical, its tone tends to be all over the place, and there's a ton of content to work through. As refined as many of its systems are, it tends to lack storytelling cohesion, and because of that, it lacks many of the qualities in its predecessor that I found admirable. As an isolated experience, it is definitely a lot more fun to play. It's a far more briskly paced game with excellent combat and plenty of things to keep players occupied for hours. It's like a family-sized bag of Final Fantasy Doritos. It tastes great, but before you know it, you've got an empty bag, a bloated belly, and nothing but dust lingering on your fingers. It's filling, but it's dumb, and it very quickly fades from memory. By the time of 13-2's announcement and its eventual release, Final Fantasy XIII's reputation had already been soured amongst those of the hardcore crowd. Though it sold incredibly well on both Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 platforms and reviewed fairly well, it helped seed the idea that Final Fantasy was on the decline in the minds of many who'd followed it loyally through its then 20-year span of entries. Everyone and their uncle had something to say about Final Fantasy XIII. As a result, general enthusiasm for 13-2 was decidedly lower. Reviews were softer, acknowledging its improvements upon the formula laid by its predecessor, but they also said that it was a work of much lesser significance due to its silly story and repetitive side quests. Final Fantasy XIII-2 was definitely a more fun game, but it came at a cost in terms of emotional investment and meaningful character development. In terms of sales, across both platforms it managed to move 3.1 million copies by January 2013, placing it at roughly half the sales of its predecessor. To put it in perspective, Final Fantasy X moved a little over 8 million copies during its sales lifetime, and X-2, its follow-up, moved roughly 5.4 million units. Considering the smaller installed base of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 in 2012 versus the sales of the PS2 at the same relative time, it follows nearly the same sales trends for the major release versus its later sequel. Interestingly, much like X-2, 13-2 followed up a largely linear base game with a non-linear sequel full of side content. Though 10-2 featured a dramatically different tone and battle system when compared with 10. In many ways, 13-2 is more of a traditional follow-up in terms of its main story's tone and the game's battle system. Ultimately, Final Fantasy XIII-2 was doomed to be a lesser experience and smaller success from the start. 13-2 might be as appealing as a big bag of Doritos, but it was chasing a burnt steak. It had the double duty of trying to follow up 13 while also doing everything it could to distance itself from 13. In that regard, it was only partially successful. But the damage that 13 did to the brand was already done, and 13-2 would have needed to pull a lot more weight than it ended up doing to rehabilitate the 13 series of games. As an Xbox 360 title, its release on the platform was less of the earth-shattering moment that 13's was, and more of a sign of continued support. Of the reported 3.1 million copies sold, a little bit less than 1 million of those were on the Xbox 360. Those numbers are no slouch, but with less than half the sales of its predecessor on the Xbox platform and the deflated enthusiasm surrounding the 13 franchise heading into release of 13-2, this tracks. It managed to retail only 20,000 or so copies on the Xbox 360 in Japan, with the rest of the copies split between North America and Europe. Not exactly a strong sign of support for the console in the land of the rising sun. One could also take these reported sales numbers as evidence of a shift in the number of consoles sold between the PS3 and the Xbox 360 across the world. By the time 13-2 was released in 2012 in North America, the PS3's lifetime sales equaled that of the Xbox 360's, with both sitting around 70 million consoles sold. Thus, the continued and even greater sales lead on the PS3 makes sense. 360 sales of 13 trailed behind PS3's in 2010, with far less PlayStation 3's out there. It doesn't take much to do the math on 13-2's sales being that much further behind on the Xbox platform. It also feels emblematic of the shift in structure and style of the game. 13 was a grandiose, Western AAA-inspired take on the JRPG with a huge marketing campaign behind it. 13-2 was a much smaller, more focused effort that fell back on many JRPG tropes in an attempt to right the wrongs that 13 was perceived to have committed. It featured a new cast of characters, relegating the core cast of its predecessor to glorified cameos at best, and its marketing did little to differentiate itself from its predecessor. As far as a piece of the Xbox 360's legacy, it's a much smaller one, for better or for worse, and with the 2012 release date in North America and Europe, it's also one of the last Japanese role-playing games to be released on the console. Much like 13, 13-2 has been made available through the Xbox Backwards Compatibility program and is currently available in a pristine 4K resolution at a mostly solid 60 FPS on the Xbox Series X and at standard 720p 60 FPS on the Series S today. Those same resolutions apply to its 1X and Standard 1 console presentations. However, the frame rate remains capped at its original target of 30 frames per second. When added to the backwards compatibility program in 2018, all three of the Final Fantasy XIII titles received a clean 3x resolution boost. Owing to the refinement of the Crystal Tools engine after the development of 13, 13-2 shipped with a clean 1280 by 720 resolution on the Xbox 360, which allowed for the true 4K target to be reached in this case. Both 13-2 and Lightning Returns received surprise FPS boosts as part of the final backwards compatibility update in November of 2020 for the series consoles, making them the definitive home of all three Final Fantasy XIII titles. 13.2 in 60 FPS, as seen here in this video, is a tighter, much more responsive experience, making the series consoles the absolute definitive place to experience 13.2 today. It rocked when they were added to the backwards compatibility program in 2018, and honestly, I was really surprised to see such efforts dedicated to them in their final backwards compatibility update. Just one final way Microsoft got to remind us that they nabbed Final Fantasy from PlayStation now and forever. That being said, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is generally a pretty good time. It's short enough that its nonsensical plot doesn't outstay its welcome too aggressively, and though its tone wildly swings from serious to stupid, the refinements and additions it makes to its predecessor's gameplay make it an absolute joy to play through. As far as JRPGs go, it's pretty easy to recommend in a world where fans gobble up each successive Kingdom Hearts release. Go in with modest expectations, and I suspect you will find yourself thoroughly entertained. On that note, having saved the past by changing the future, it is time to say farewell to the sequel to my most favorite of Japanese role-playing games, and time to look towards the extreme future. That's right, it's time to round out the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy with the next episode of our look at the JRPGs of the Xbox 360. I'll see you all in episode 6 on Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. So you've reached the part in the video where the video writer always asks you to like and subscribe, but I'm pulling like 100 views on these things maybe. So I'm really just gonna thank you guys for stopping by and giving this the time of day. It took 4 months for this video to materialize. I finished this game on January 1st, 2022, and then I just got super busy at work. And then I got stricken with like really debilitating carpal tunnel. And basically my body's been breaking down like an old car ever since. So the fact that I finally had time to sit down and do this is huge. And I'm going to try to not take 4 months to do Lightning Returns. But I can't make any promises because I have not finished a big game since 13.2. I have not had, like, the energy with my wrists to, like, finish a 40-hour video game. So we're going to see how this goes. Anyways, thanks for stopping by, and I hope you enjoyed my mediocre Sonic playing that I'm laying this over the top of. And here's to the next video. Am I right? Take care.